Take a look at this map. See all those countries marked out? Guess what's common between them? All of them are under economic sanctions. Maybe their leaders or their bankers or their financial system, in some way or the other, all these countries are sanctioned. That's around 1/3 of the world. Imagine that. 33% of the world is living under some sort of sanctions. But here's the irony. Most of it doesn't even work. It's like fighting a bear with a walking stick. Does it count as a defensive tool? On paper, I guess it does. But will it really make a difference? That's where the stick fails, and so do sanctions. They're just a safer alternative to military intervention. Your soldiers stay in your barracks, your guns in your holster, and your conscience intact. But where did this idea come from? And how have sanctions evolved over the last century? Time for a flashback. First things first, what are sanctions? It's the action taken against the economy of another country. The objective is not financial though, it is political. You weaken the economy, you force the leadership to act. At least that's the hope. Parents with teenagers would know. You withhold pocket money when your kids act out. But the idea isn't to make them poor, is it? The idea is to teach them a lesson. Just one problem though. Like teenagers, nations are unpredictable. So sanctions can be counterproductive. The policy is as old as politics itself. Ancient Greece is said to have pioneered sanctions. The city of Athens banned traders from another city, Megara. And did it work? Well, Megara turned to Sparta for help. They ended up fighting for 30 years with Athens, and eventually the war ended Greece's golden age. So I guess that's a hard no. But these were rudimentary sanctions, nothing targeted or complicated about them. A more sophisticated attempt was made by Napoleon. In 1806, he announced the continental blockade. He tried to cut off Britain from Europe. No trade, no travel, not even mail. And did that work? Well, Imperial Russia did not support the blockade, so Napoleon invaded Russia to force them. He lost 300,000 men, his kingdom, and his reputation. So again, a hard no. By the 20th century, sanctions became more formal. One organization played a key role in that, the League of Nations. We've done a whole episode on that. You can watch it on this link. The League thought sanctions were a jackpot. Then US President Woodrow Wilson called it a silent, deadly, and terrible remedy. Pretty soon it was put to the test. In 1935, fascist Italy invaded Ethiopia. The League got a chance to use its shiny new tool. 4 separate sanctions were imposed on Italy and its dictator Benito Mussolini.
The League of Nations Assembly decided by an overwhelming majority in favor of sanctions against Italy. 51 nations agreed to bring economic and financial pressure to bear on Italy as aggressor in the war in Africa.
Did it help? Well, hundreds of thousands of Ethiopian civilians were killed, their country was occupied, and Mussolini remained in power. So once again, the answer is no. The sanctions against Italy had 2 major problems that are relevant today as well. One, they did not include key items. Things like oil, steel, and coal were excluded. Those were the main ingredients of war. But the League did not include them in the sanctions. Why? It's an interesting story. Britain and France were scared. They thought Mussolini would react aggressively to an oil embargo. So guess what they did? They asked him. They asked him if he would object to an oil embargo. Of course, Mussolini said yes. So oil was struck off the sanctions list. That's one reason. The second reason was the narrow implementation. Germany was on Italy's side, so they ignored the sanctions. The US was neutral, so they ignored the sanctions. Eventually, the sanctions failed. It was a sign of things to come. The United States tried to do the same with Japan. They put the squeeze on in 1941. Japanese funds in the US were frozen. There was an oil embargo as well. But I come back to my fateful question. Did it work? Well, in December that year, Pearl Harbor happened. Japan attacked a US base in Hawaii.
The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
So once again, I guess not. The sanctions failed. All these examples tell a story. Most countries are not scared or deterred by sanctions. They try to work around them. Or even worse, they prepare for them. Hitler did that in the late 1930s. He knew there would soon be economic sanctions on Germany. So what did he do? He invaded other countries for resources. I'm not saying that was the only reason, but it was certainly one of them. Another problem with sanctions is consistency. It was a big minus in the last century. Your ally today could be your enemy tomorrow. I have another story for you. In 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland. It was called the Winter War. The US was firmly in Finland's corner. President Franklin Roosevelt called the Soviet Union a dictatorship. He also imposed a moral embargo. Certain products would not be sold to the Soviets, like airplanes or engines or spare parts. Cut to 1941, the equation changed. Germany was now the bigger threat, not the Soviets. So what did Roosevelt do? He did a 360. He lifted the embargo and gave military aid to the very same Soviet Union. What's more, he cut off ties with Finland. By then, the Finns had allied with Nazi Germany. All of this happened in just 3 years. So my point is, sanctions tend to be slippery. You use them for one objective, but the result can be completely different. In most cases, two things happen. One, there is more hatred. The regime you sanction ends up becoming your sworn enemy, like Iran and North Korea for the US. The people also blame you for their troubles. And two, you become self-sufficient. Think of it as a long power cut. At first, you're frustrated and restless. You can't wait to watch TV again. But eventually, you learn to adjust. Maybe even invent a little game to play with the neighbors. Every sanctioned country has done that. Look at these restaurants in Russia. They used to be McDonald's. But after the sanctions, they were Vkusno and Tochka. I can't vouch for the taste though. So does this mean sanctions are absolutely pointless? Well, perhaps not. There is one instance that stands out. The Suez Canal crisis of 1956. Egypt had decided to nationalize the canal, but Britain and France were unhappy, so they plotted with Israel to topple Egypt's then president, Gamal Abdel Nasser. Britain, France and Israel were much superior, yet they lost. One reason for that was sanctions imposed by the United States. The war was bankrupting the UK, so President Eisenhower pulled the trigger. He said, if you don't withdraw, we will sell pound sterling bonds. It was too much for Britain. They withdrew immediately. So I guess sanctions can work if you have enough leverage, if you have enough economic power, and if you have the political will. But ticking those boxes is hard, especially today. During the Suez crisis, Britain did not have a choice. They could either back down or go bust. But that's not the case today. Now, if the US sanctions you, you can trade with China. If China embargoes, you can get help from America. So you have many options, which is why sanctions never seem to work. Iraq was sanctioned for close to 13 years. That did not topple Saddam Hussein. The US military did that. In Afghanistan, the first Taliban regime was sanctioned in 1999. No impact. It was the guns that drove them out. And I'm not saying that we should use military instead of sanctions. I'm saying they are not alternatives. You can't use sanctions instead of force. They're so easy to impose that leaders are almost addicted, especially US presidents. They jump at the chance of sanctioning someone. But what has it achieved? North Korea has a nuclear weapon. Iran hasn't agreed to a nuclear deal. Russia is still invading Ukraine. China is still imprisoning Uyghurs. And the Taliban are still ruling Afghanistan. It's the people who are hurting.